Then the inequalities were in lack of access to opportunities for jobs, housing, education, and social services. In 1998, 30 years after the Kerner Report, Senator Fred Harris said, quote, "There is more poverty in America. It is deeper, blacker, and browner than before, and it is more concentrated in the cities, which have become America's poorhouses," unquote. The inequalities exist today. Just since January of 2009, unemployment has skyrocketed among African Americans from 12.7% to 16.7%. Among Hispanics, the unemployment rate is currently 11.3%. While intensifying among people of color, poverty today is colorblind. Foreclosures have spread through all American neighborhoods as a wildfire, consuming with it the hopes and dreams of millions. We had a moral urgency to address unemployment in the inner cities, but we failed as a society on that. We have learned that writ large in the fate of people who live in our cities has been the fate of those who live in the suburbs, because the same massive economic machinery that for generations was crushing the hopes of millions of inner city Americans, banks who disinvested, insurance companies who redlined, businesses which pulled out, this same plague is now visited throughout America. The official unemployment figure of 9.1% conceals a much larger, more devastating picture in America. According to a recent study by Youngstown State University, the de facto unemployment conceived and computed by their Center for Working Class Studies is 26.37%. This figure includes individuals who are no longer looking for work, discouraged, underemployed, and those who are marginally employed. Corporations, meanwhile, are sitting on trillions of dollars and not hiring because of uncertainty, insinuating that small changes in federal regulations or tax policy are killing jobs. Yet we know that massive changes in federal tax policy and government regulations have taken place at periods of great economic growth in the United States. Our economy has not hit a rough spot on the road. It has hit a wall. The greatest losers in today's economic system are the young. They've been fleeced. They were promised good jobs with good pay if they got a good education. Millions have done that, only to discover that the jobs that were promised were not there. Millions of young people have moved in with their family and friends, barely scraping by, dreading the student loans that they have to repay. They dread when those loans come due. The major fault of our domestic economy is the failure to produce good-paying jobs for all Americans. The reason for high unemployment and low-paying jobs are many, but two major reasons stand out: lack of consumer demand and stagnant wages accompanying low union participation. There is a lack of consumer demand in an economy that is 70% dependent on consumer spending. There are those who say we can spur demand with more tax cuts for businesses. Well, this fails the test of experience. Business received tax. We still have high unemployment. Business profits greater than ever. Investment less. We have learned from the past few years that businesses will not invest while the economy is in bad shape. Since World War II, America has come out of every recession in less than a year. But this time we had a false recovery. The economic numbers improved briefly while stimulus was injected. Today we're back in a recession, a double-dip recession, that is destroying people's lives and setting back our nation. We did not have enough stimulus to begin with. As the stimulus runs out, things are getting worse. The recession is feeding on itself. In 1937, a second round of depression surfaced as stimulus was withdrawn, requiring another effort by the government to stabilize the economy. The parallel between 1937 and 2011 is obvious. We need a second stimulus, and it has to be strong enough to put millions of Americans back to work. State and local governments are forced to lay off people by the hundreds of thousands. These layoffs are not introducing efficiency. They undermine service. They reduce the necessary role of government in the life of a community. Massive aid is needed to all areas of government, not because governments have spent recklessly, but because revenues are down. Income tax revenue is down. Sales tax revenue is down. Property tax revenue is down due to foreclosures. We can stimulate the economy by providing revenue to rehire state and local government employees. This is the easiest way to put hundreds of thousands back to work. This is an obvious way to stimulate the economy on a significant scale. State, local government, public schools, public and private colleges would all have an enhanced ability to restore service. Such a stimulus would create an economic climate where businesses will expand their investment, utilizing their own profit. The same thing is true in the housing area. The government must immediately implement a new housing program. More and more properties are becoming vacant and vandalized while people are doubling up. We need a full-scale program where economically troubled homeowners are given the right to rent at market rate property in foreclosure. The government would provide a rent subsidy while the homeowners seek work. After all, the American people want work, not welfare. There should be work for those who are able to work. Government must become the employer of last resort. The private sector is not providing the jobs. When the private sector fails to provide the jobs, the government has a moral responsibility and a practical responsibility to step forward to put the country back to work. As with FDR and the New Deal, the government must now put millions of Americans back to work rebuilding our infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers issued a report that there are $2.2 trillion in infrastructure rebuilding that must take place to move the commerce of America. It's not enough to describe the situation and make a few suggestions as to what could be done to take us in a new direction. But there comes a time when we need to look at some dramatic change that needs to be done to restructure our economy. This month I'm going to be introducing a bill which will be aimed at addressing our structural economic problems directly. It is called the National Employment Economic Defense Act, the NEAT Act. America needs millions of jobs. How can we create millions of jobs in a time of annual deficits, long-term debt, and contracting budgets? Here's how. The Federal Reserve creates money out of nothing. And as we all know, it's given it to the banks. The Fed assumed that power through an act of Congress. The Federal Reserve has used all of its standard monetary policy tools. But the American economy is not getting any better. Whatever the Fed is doing, it is not working. The reason why is perhaps best explained by the Fed itself. Quote, the Fed can't control inflation or influence output and employment, unquote. The Fed has been buying Treasury and other securities to put downward pressure on interest rates. The idea is to lower finance costs, encourage more borrowing, and nudge investors into riskier investments. This provides breathing space, but little else. Consumers are already over their heads in debt. They aren't going to borrow more. Neither will producers whose sales are slack. High default rates are widening spreads. Many investors will still prefer to make a small gain on government securities rather than risk taking losses. Reality beats theory. The reality is that not enough people have enough money. Why is this? Where does the money come from? Why isn't it coming? The Fed doesn't create money we use in our bank accounts. The banks do. Most of this money is created when banks make loans. This is why the Fed can't control inflation or influence output and employment. Output and employment depend on demand. Demand depends on how much money people have or can borrow. Because banks create this money, they control demand. If banks aren't lending or borrowers aren't borrowing, new money isn't being created to replace the money removed when bank loans are paid. So the money supply shrinks. The Fed can only put